I got a seemingly simple question on Game of Thrones: A Song of Ice and Fire, and frankly, I think I could talk about it for an hour solid. We're going to try to keep this video relatively brief, but I got a simple question about political significance of Jon Snow's short career up at the Wall. And the fellow asking the question, from just the few words I said about Jon Snow in an earlier video, he inferred that I share his sense that Jon Snow is in large part to blame for his own fate up in the Wall. It's very interesting that this guy asking the question said that, because I mentioned Jon Snow extremely briefly, but I mentioned that he was actually overstepping his responsibilities in reaching out to try to alleviate the starvation of the wildlings. That Jon Snow, really, his position there was as a military commander. He's only responsible for feeding the men who are in service inside the Wall. He is not responsible for feeding the peasants. He is not responsible for feeding the wildlings who are there as refugees at that point in the story, etc., etc. But it's significant that in contrast to other characters, in contrast to Tyrion, in contrast to many other political leaders, Jon Snow is really concerned about the starvation of his people, I suppose. He chooses to treat them as his people, even though he has no obligation towards them. Many other political leaders really do have obligations to worry about their people, but don't. So I mentioned that contrast in passing, and this guy says, well, can you speak more about the extent to which Jon Snow is responsible for his own downfall? Well, I'll take a step further in this response. I mean, first off, I feel like making a kind of peculiar caveat here. The political themes in A Song of Ice and Fire simply reflect the interests of the author, George R.R. Martin. And especially when he started writing these books, George R.R. Martin did not have any delusion that he could influence American politics. And of course, that was quite accurate. George R.R. Martin was not particularly famous and not particularly successful and not particularly influential when he started writing the first book in this series. That's not to say his career was a failure, but neither in his character nor in terms of the success, the limited success he had in his career, he wasn't in a position to imagine that he was going to have some kind of tremendous impact on the American political spectrum. Now, it'll be interesting to see, maybe in his next book, maybe now as he gets into the last couple of books, maybe he will now think of himself as having political influence. But to give an example, some of the themes he deals with are genuine political themes that genuinely interest him in his reading of history, but they can't possibly have any real ramifications for the United States of America in the year 2016 or the year 2017 or the year 2020. So one of the themes, it's prominent throughout all the books, is really a critique of the fact that feudalism continues to put people in positions of real political power when they're still teenagers or when they're still very young, when they're too young. Now again, in the United States of America, that's not their problem. On the contrary, you might say that it's a problem that the United States of America keeps putting people into positions of power when they're over 70 years old, when they're perhaps too old. Now, as one example, I'm sorry, I don't have a biography of Francis Bacon here to hand, but in the 17th century, the early 17th century, one of the one of the most important political figures in the United Kingdom, in England, is Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon is born in 1561 and dies in 1626. So sorry, he spans 2 centuries there. Obviously, I was referring to him as 17th century. He is first elected to Parliament at about 20 years of age. Sorry, I don't have the precise date here. As I recall, he may have only been 19 when he got elected to Parliament. He was about 20 years old when he's elected to Parliament. And before that, as I recall, he actually had a couple of reasonably important positions in government when he was still a teenager. I'm sorry, I don't have the details, but I think he had a couple of jobs, so to speak, related to the government of the realm before he won that election. Today, that's unheard of. That's unthinkable. That's just Parliament. Parliament doesn't give you executive power over life and death the way that Joffrey does in A Song of Ice and Fire, the way that Robb Stark does. I mean, Robb Stark is having to make decisions about who gets their head chopped off as soon as he comes into office. And he comes into office because of who his father is and because of the circumstances of his father's death. Robb Stark and Joffrey obviously are examples of bad political leaders. I think in a much more subtle and nuanced way, Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen also are presented to us as examples of bad, not good, political leaders. And you're missing the point if you think that Jon Snow or Daenerys are held up, for our uncritical adulation as examples of great humanitarians. Now, Jon Snow and Daenerys, I do think their plot lines have a couple of important parallels. One, both Jon Snow and Daenerys are motivated by sincere humanitarian instincts. They want to help people. They're concerned about the poor. They're concerned about the starving. In Daenerys' case, she's concerned about the treatment of slaves, concerned about people being tortured to death, etc. Obviously, the plots are different. I can't really use one set of adjectives for both Daenerys and for Jon Snow. They both come into political power. They try to make the situation better. To simplify slightly, they make the situation worse. In some ways, they make the situation better. In some ways, they make the situation worse. They're then dealing with increasing hostility from the people they're ruling, increasing opposition from exactly the people they rely on. And then I think they have a twist in their plot, which is currently the end of 2016. This is where we're at in the published works. In Jon Snow's case, he actually dies and comes back from the dead. But in any case, both of them have a near-death experience. Daenerys' case, we don't think she actually dies, but when the books end currently, she is very close to death, and don't underestimate that. She is hallucinating, she has diarrhea or perhaps dysentery, she is dehydrated and starving in the middle of a wasteland, wandering hopelessly, trying to get back to the capital city. Now, I don't think she is going to die, but in both cases, their plots have a turning point where they've had a near-death experience. They're reduced to ruination, and where they seem to have lost all or most of their political support. So, in those broad brushstrokes, there's a parallelism there. But, again, fundamentally, this is not a political issue that's easy to apply to the United States today. When was the last time somebody at 19 or 20 years old was elected to parliament in England or in America or Canada or in any of our Western democracies? It's unheard of. It's unthinkable now. And for someone as a teenager to be put in a position of executive power, of making life and death decisions, of starting wars, of negotiating peace treaties, these kinds of foreign policy decisions. We even have, Brandon Stark briefly is kind of judge, jury, and executioner as a very young child up at Winterfell because Robb is absent. As I recall, we have a couple of weeks or a couple of months when he's in charge of business at Winterfell before it's conquered and taken over by the Ironborn. So we have remarkably young children and teenagers putting on the crown and making those decisions. And George is uniformly critical of this throughout the books, again, just because it is his own interest. It's not a critique that can possibly change or influence politics today. And I think that just reflects his own opinion or his own frustration in spending so much time reading medieval history, Renaissance history, the history of Europe, the history of China. He's someone who, enjoys and draws material from reading history of many parts of the world. But there's no sense in which he's a, neutral observer of that. Obviously, he cares passionately about that. That's something that comes out in his writing. So Jon Snow, first and foremost, very broadly speaking, Jon Snow's career up to his death is not the portrait of a good ruler and is not the portrait of a competent ruler. And we can be even more harsh in the case of Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys is not a good ruler and she's not a competent ruler. However, she is motivated by humanitarian instincts. She is motivated by compassion. Jon also is motivated by compassion. You have a situation where Jon is, the Night's Watch themselves are worried about starving to death during the winter. Winter is just starting or hasn't yet begun. And Jon Snow is out there dividing up the last of their apples and oranges and giving them to these refugees, giving them to the, this population of people who he is not the king or governor of, whom he has no responsibility to, which is already a very serious, moral question. I'll just mention, everyone knows that George R.R. Martin is to some extent responding to the Vietnam War, and I also on this YouTube channel talk a great deal about the history of the Vietnam War. Part of my own research experience and my own life experience has been in places like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and, part of the world that was torn apart and redefined by the United States intervention in Vietnam. That political history matters to me a great deal. even though I'm some decades younger than George R.R. Martin. But, when you read the history of the Vietnam War, people kind of newbies, they often kind of object to the immorality of American servicemen with the assumption that those American servicemen had a moral obligation to help the peasants, the common people, to be involved in domestic policy and human rights and education or what have you of the normal people of a country like Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia. And on the contrary, in a sense, you may be all the more harshly castigating of American foreign policy when you understand this. You have to understand, no, those men are following a chain of command. They're just playing a combat role. They're not there to feed the poor or provide education or be concerned with human rights or what have you. There are other people in the U.S. government who do have that responsibility, and some of them are in Congress, and some of them are in the State Department, and some of them are in other departments down the line. But it's quite wrong to look at those soldiers and say, well, why didn't you do blank? Why weren't you concerned with this? And, it takes a very strange sort of sympathy to read that history and sympathize with men who were following orders, sometimes to slaughter civilians, sometimes to torture civilians. But those were their orders, and that's what they were doing. As really, reading that history and understanding what's going on, it's beyond having sympathy for the devil, And I've met some of those guys. Recently, too. I talked about this on YouTube. I talked to a Vietnam War veteran here who talked to me quite openly about atrocities or crimes against humanity that he committed himself. And, I sit there and listen to him, frankly, with all due sympathy. And I know he was not the author of that war, and in most cases, he didn't make those decisions. And the reason why he's telling me is precisely that he's not proud. And I think on some level, he wants the next generation to know and appreciate what happened and why it happened, etc. But, the wall, the soldiers at the wall, likewise, they are this army of occupation. And, their enemy for many, many generations, even if mistakenly so, are the wildlings. And now Jon Snow is, unceremoniously and undemocratically completely changing the purpose of that military organization. And he is, with very sincere, humanitarian concern, violating the principles of their whole mission, and is trying to make them feed and clothe and house the poor, and is, admitting women into their military unit, whereas formerly they didn't have any women at all. That was, excluded. He's taking on these people in this new capacity and so on. Now, is that why Jon Snow was assassinated? To some extent, we don't know yet. There's a brief passage where Cersei sits down with her co-conspirators in King's Landing, and she says she's going to carry out some kind of plot, some kind of devious plot to get rid of Jon Snow or change the situation up at the wall in the north. As I recall, it's very vaguely stated what she's going to do. She's going to send some people there, or she's going to have some secret agents there carry out her plan. I think it was intentional that we didn't know quite what Cersei was going to pull. And it is possible that Cersei's plot is what we've already seen, that her co-conspirators at the wall already, in killing Jon Snow, that was them carrying out the mission that she's alluding to in that passage. But it's also possible that after Jon Snow comes back from the dead, he's going to face and deal with that plot of Cersei's henchmen. Maybe they haven't even arrived yet. Maybe it's something completely in the future of the plot. So we don't know. To some extent, there may have been Lannister meddling, and indeed Baratheon meddling, from King's Landing in changing his political situation. However, with that having been said, the text is not kind to Jon Snow. The text shows us a teenager who is completely ill-equipped to deal with his mission in life. He's ill-equipped to deal with it in a military sense. He's ill-equipped to deal with it in a political sense. And, it's true, he looks good in those negotiations with Stannis Baratheon. There are various passages in which Jon Snow seems to be wise beyond his years. But, of course, there are many others in which he's not, in which he is precisely as wise as his years, no more and no less. And, with Daenerys, I don't know. I don't even think I need to spell it out. Daenerys says she's going to abolish slavery, and she sells out. right? She gives up her own principles. She becomes, in effect, a moderately pro-slavery person, allowing slavery on the docks, allowing the slave trade, just trying to stabilize the situation instead of fundamentally changing the situation. Daenerys, we get to see her in about 2 paragraphs go from being totally opposed to the use of torture to endorsing and actively using torture against her enemies, against her supposed enemies, in a desperate attempt to get intelligence. Now, again, I think the significance of that choice, given the whole political context that George R.R. Martin was writing in during these decades in which the books were created, given, many people see Daenerys in Marine as a parallel to the United States in Iraq or the United States in Afghanistan. There are also parallels that maybe get overlooked to the history of the United Kingdom in Ireland. I felt as soon as I read the material with the masks, with the soldiers having to wear masks to cover up their identity when they're supporting the government of occupation, I thought, wow, that really resonates with the experience of Ireland, with the black and tans and what have you, with men having to live in secrecy. If they were Irish men working on the pro-British side, the pro-government side of having to live in that kind of city, that really resonates that right away. But of course, it doesn't mean it's inapplicable to the situation in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan right now, we have a lot of Afghans who worked for the American side applying to migrate to Canada or applying to migrate to the United States. And they're being evacuated. And when they fill out those applications, whether they're applying to the United States or Canada or both, they say simply, if you leave me behind here, if you leave me behind in Afghanistan, I'll be killed because I worked for your side. And I try to keep it secret. They do try to keep it secret, those guys. But enough people know it that sooner or later they'll be found out and they'll be exterminated. Now that the United States is withdrawing, or allegedly withdrawing. We'll see. We'll see to what extent the United States really withdraws forces from either front. But anyway, so Daenerys, we see, a very clear story arc, again, in some ways parallel to Jon Snow. And in both cases, they start off as teenagers with good intentions, with humanitarian instincts, with real compassion. But they also both have no explicitly articulated political philosophy. None. Now, Varys has a political philosophy, and it's articulated. Arguably, Littlefinger maybe has a political philosophy that's explicitly articulated. I mean, it's debatable. Some of the other old men in power, they may also, articulate a political philosophy. But Jon Snow doesn't have one, and Daenerys doesn't have one. And I would say that's probably part of the plot twist we're looking at now, with both of them having a near-death experience. Jon Snow dying, coming back from the dead. Daenerys almost dying and coming back from the wilderness. I think when they come back, the whole point is going to be that for both of them, it crystallizes for them that they need to have a strategy that they themselves understand and articulate to the people they're ruling. That they need to have a modus operandi. They need to have some set of principles that defines what they're doing and why they're doing it. Again, this is part of what makes it also alien to the world we live in today. Frankly, Francis Bacon is a great example to kick this off with. We remember Francis Bacon as an old man. We remember Francis Bacon for his philosophy of science, for his philosophy of democracy, which is him writing as an old man. I have no idea what Francis Bacon was like when he was 18 years old and 20 years old in government. Maybe at 20 years old, Francis Bacon was the worst parliamentarian in the British system. Look, I don't remember what is the youngest work I've read by Francis Bacon, but Francis Bacon, his major contributions to philosophy of science and indeed political philosophy, this is all an old man looking back on decades and decades of experience in government, and you can say that his political education was serving in government from his teenage years forward, right? So that was his college. He didn't have to go to university and get a BA or something like this. He started at such a young age in government, he was able to look back on that. But perhaps if we did have access to, I don't know, maybe some historians do have access to his more juvenile writings or his more juvenile role in government. It's, the difference between him at age, in his 50s as opposed to him in his 20s must be extreme. Obviously, in a highly dramatized form in these texts, we get to see these characters mature. We get to see their perspective on authority itself being transformed by the experience of being an authority in No Time Flat. These books can't drag it out and give us 20 years of Jon Snow maturing. And it has to be remembered, they aren't the only characters we see turning a corner like that, even though it is very briefly handled. Jeor Mormont, the old bear, the Mormont commander of the Night's Watch on the Wall, we get to see his political philosophy transform down to his dying day, where he's actually having to reconsider why does this military service exist? What is our relationship to the wildlings? Why are we fighting the wrong war? Why are we fighting against the wildlings instead of fighting against fighting against the Great Other, etc., etc. Now, with all that having been said, when Daenerys comes back from her near-death experience, what is her political philosophy going to be? I have no idea. It seems to me unlikely that George is going to have her come back as a simple fire and blood dictator. But it's possible. I mean, we already have Cersei Lannister showing one face of dictatorship. It is quite possible that Daenerys will come back hardened and having no sympathy anymore for the peasants she formerly tried to help, formerly tried to feed, no sympathy anymore for the slaves she formerly tried to liberate. It's possible she'll come back with no sympathy for the slave owners, that she'll just be exterminating the slave owners instead of taking a more moderate path. I don't know. But whatever it is then going to be counterposed to other people in the Game of Thrones who have other very different approaches to politics, what have you. I mean, what lesson can Jon Snow learn? What is the conclusion he is going to draw from his experience, where he really did violate both the letter and the spirit of the military code he was supposed to live by? To say he was delinquent in his duties is an understatement. He totally abandoned the whole raison d'etre for the Night's Watch. He's guilty as charged. He's absolutely guilty as charged. Did he do that in pursuit of a higher ideal? Did he do it with humanitarian intentions, etc.? Sure. But, I mean, there's no question that Jon Snow, he's guilty of gross dereliction of duty. He's guilty of perverting the whole purpose of the Night's Watch. And to me, that is symbolized very well by Jon Snow going with a couple of his fellow officers, to give away their food and their apples to these starving wildlings. Sure. That alone, even though it's a beautiful gesture, and it's a contrast to all the other political leaders who just didn't care when the peasants were starving to death. Those aren't their apples, and that's not the role of the Night's Watch, right? But of course, also everyone already knows there's this dramatic scene just before his death when Jon Snow calls for volunteers to go and march against Winterfell. So this is an even more clear dereliction of duty. So yes, I mean, it's easy to paint Jon Snow's conflict in terms of racism against the wildlings, and his being assessed. Of course, that is an element, and I think all the books show an interest in racism, and especially when the races concerned have a very unclear dotted line between them. George likes to set up those situations and play with the ethical ambiguities. But, in every sense, in the book, whether or not this is true in the TV shows, in the book, Jon Snow is dead wrong. And the group of assassins who move against them, if you really think it through, it's quite easy to sympathize with their motives. So in both cases, I don't know, are we now going to see Jon Snow come back as a remorseless dictator? I doubt it. It's quite possible you'll see Jon Snow come back as even more committed to the higher ideals he was trying to serve previously, and of realizing that those ideals are not compatible with military service in the Night's Watch. But maybe they are compatible with him being the rebel leader of a bunch of wildlings trying to conquer Winterfell. Wouldn't be hard to, predict that. Or maybe he's a rebel leader of a bunch of northern lords fighting against the Boltons. Fill in the blanks. Or maybe he becomes a rebel leader divinely inspired by the Red God or one of these other religions. Unlikely but possible. Maybe he's divinely inspired by the old gods in the trees or what have you. But I mean, two big tropes in the books maybe make readers uncomfortable. Generally, I mean, I think the books, as they've progressed, they have gone from a very secular world to a world that is more and more jihadist, to be blunt. I remember talking about this with my teacher here. I've been talking about Game of Thrones in Chinese and writing essays about it in Chinese as a way of practicing the language, at the start of the books, partly because the point of view chapters were given, the way the books are written, we're given a lot of point of views from Tyrion's perspective. Tyrion is a totally secular, anti-religious character. He thinks organized religion is a joke, etc., etc. We get the sense in the beginning that, of course, magic is dead in the world, that religion is a joke. We get this very cynical, secular, down-to-earth view of the world. And then gradually, as the books progress, we realize that's not everybody's view of the world. There are a lot of very sincerely religious people, even fanatical religious people. And on the contrary, the fever pitch of religiosity in this world seems to be elevating. Of course, with the Iron Islands plot, that religion, and, the rise of Euron as a semi-fanatical, religious figure, and the rise of the cult of the Red God, but even the, what we see Bran go through with the peculiar gods of the old religion, this world has become more and more a world dominated by religious warfare, religious ideology as the books progress, partly because our perspective changes as readers, and partly because of the real political developments in the world. And on the other hand, I think we also see, the resolution of formerly irresolute political ideologies, right? So Varys comes out of the shadow and reveals exactly what his political philosophy is and exactly what it means. Back in book 1, there was a lot of dancing around about that. It was genuinely secret, and we got a lot of kind of peculiar, provocative hints at who he was, what he was about, what objectives he was pursuing. And now it's crystal clear when he's standing there murdering Kevin Lannister, exactly what Varys is about, exactly what his political philosophy is, both in theory and in practice. A lot of people wonder, are we going to see a major figure like Jon Snow or Daenerys supporting democracy? Well, my leitmotif for this video is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon believed in democracy, and he talks about democracy, very interestingly, in the context of his philosophy of science. He believes that the progress of science is itself democratic, which is a very interesting concept, also very much debatable. I mean, in some ways, the progress of science is very elitist. Not everyone can participate in the progress of chemistry or biochemistry or in advanced research into the human genome via biochemistry. There are elitist aspects, there are very undemocratic aspects of how science works and how scientific research works, how science progresses. But he also has some really interesting points in saying that science is a democracy of knowledge or is democratic. And it's obvious that in his own political milieu, he was a voice for democracy in a sense. Why do I mention that? Well, in another sense, you could say that in Francis Bacon's period of time in England, there was no such thing as democracy, and there was even no real concept of democracy. The philosophy of democracy was incredibly weak and distant. This was a period of history in Europe completely dominated by monarchy, and where democracy was a very far off and muted concept. And you could also say in Francis Bacon's career, well, if that was his objective, if he was serious about democracy, he failed. It's also a very interesting way to look at the career of a major politician like Francis Bacon. Well, was he a success? He left us these writings about democracy and science. Did he actually manage to transform his own society to reflect those ideas? No. So he's a failure, or he's a dreamer, or he was ahead of his time, whatever you want to say. Okay, that's all interesting, worth talking about. Is it possible in a fictional universe like Game of Thrones for someone to come out advocating for an idea like democracy when it's totally alien to that society? Yes, I think like Francis Bacon, I think you could have someone advocating for science in some sense. I think you could have someone advocating for democracy in some sense. Is it going to be Jon Snow or Daenerys? I doubt it. Maybe we're going to see both of them harden their political philosophies before those philosophies become brittle and break. I don't know. I mean, when you look at Daenerys Targaryen, is there anyone in a position to say to her, you were supposed to be representing the slaves and you sold them out? Your original principles were that nobody would ever be tortured again, and you sold out. You started using torture. There's nobody. I mean, Barristan Selmy could do it, but who is going to criticize her or give her that comeuppance? She is in the position of being an unquestioned dictator in many ways, and there's nobody to even have that debate with her. It's a very interesting debate to have. But yes, it's quite possible we're going to see Daenerys return as the bringer of fire and blood, as this unrepentant dictator type of figure, and then maybe at some point we'll see her realize how far she strayed from her original ideals in the hardening of her own political ideology, and maybe we'll see a similar arc with Jon Snow, where Jon Snow now becomes a more brutal leader of a resistance movement. Maybe like Lady Stoneheart or something. And maybe he is successful right away. Maybe right away he's able to take over Winterfell. George rarely makes it that easy on his protect. It's rare for it to be that easy, right? It's possible, but I doubt it. But again, maybe we'll see him harden into a more brutal and less humanitarian sort of political leader before at some point hitting a realization that he has strayed very, very far from the ideals that led him to erode his own political position at Winterfell by trying to help the people who had been for centuries, the enemies of the Night's Watch. That resulted in him going into the storerooms of the Night's Watch at the Wall and getting out their apples and bread and handing them out to a bunch of refugees whom he had no obligation to help. That idealism, may be lost and then refound in this period of civil war. But obviously George can do whatever he wants to do with it. But at bottom, what we're shown again and again is that teenagers make terrible rulers, whether it's Joffrey or Robb Stark or Jon Snow. There is simply, I believe, in George R.R. Martin's view of the world, there is no such thing as a good 16-year-old tyrant. There is just no such thing. There is no such thing even as a good 19-year-old dictator. And again, that's not a critique that's applicable to politics in the United States right now. It's not even applicable to parliamentary democracy right now. I think legally it's possible to elect 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds, but we don't do it anymore. Culturally, we've drifted so far away from that. But part of the overall harsh tone of George's writing about this is, I think, a sense of repugnance for what he sees happening in the history of the world again and again in his reading of ancient, medieval, and Renaissance history. That as soon as power is put into the hands of these young people, whether it's because their fathers have been killed in war or through rebellion or some other circumstance, things tend to go downhill quick. And the last thing that George would ever show us, I'm disagreeing with President J. The last thing George would ever show us is that these political problems are resolved simply because the person who ends up sitting on the throne at the end of an internecine civil war of this kind happens to be a philosopher king. There's no such thing as a philosopher king, not in real life and not in Game of Thrones. And if you think that Jon Snow, making the decisions that lead up to his own assassination, is acting as some kind of benign dictator or some kind of perfect philosopher king, you're dead wrong. That's not the point of the text at all.